And then cue the Baudrillard mix.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to another fantastic edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with your hosts, Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, consider throwing us $1 a month of that fiat, that sweet, sweet fiat currency over at www.patreon.com/MUHH, or maybe consider dropping us an awesome review on iTunes. Either way, we appreciate y'all. Today, we're having a look at Michel Serres' The Birth of Physics. What made you choose this? My thought process was maybe because I had mentioned bringing back Thomas Nail, who has worked extensively on Lucretius, and a lot of this material would be good preparation for when Thomas comes, whenever we do decide to have him back, and if we do delve in to Lucretius. And I mean, some of this discussion could probably also, if you wanted to jump back for listeners to our episode Marx in Motion, there may be a little bit of, or, you know, we also did Marx's
and we did the
dissertation. So
Marx's
that's
dissertation.
That's Epicurus versus Democritus.
Yes.
Which also plays a role in that because, you know, Epicurus was an atomist, as was Democritus, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So what was your kind of thought process?
I mean, obviously, I think that that's a great context for listeners who may, especially for newer listeners who haven't delved into the archives, so to speak, of our episodes, right? Because last time we had Thomas Nail on, and he's a prolific author. You guys listening should check him out. Get his book any way you can. We had him on to talk about Marx in Motion. And to prepare for that episode the week before, I believe we did the episode on Marx, Democritus, and Epicurus, and discussed his dissertation, which, you know, it wasn't something that was, I don't even think, available in English. I think we said this, right? Until like the 50s, something like that.
Yeah, it was a fairly recent translation, if I recall.
And that was really interesting to read, and it helped to prepare the way for our discussion with Thomas Nail, who I do think we should have back. He's got 3 volumes on Lucretius, the first of which would be similar to the Marx in Motion book. It's called Lucretius I, Ontology in Motion. And I even was looking at it a little bit for the preparation of this talk. So you definitely read my mind, because I didn't mention that I was. I just kind of glanced at some of the opening material that he has, and he said something similar to what he said to us. I believe he said to us on the episode where he, you know, when discussing Lucretius's text, he avoids translating the Latin corpora, bodies, as atoms, which is a typical move when translating Lucretius and talking about him, because he's quote unquote an atomist, one of the later atomists, you know, following up in the Epicurean school, and from Democritus, Democritus. I kind of say it both ways. I don't know why. Anyway,
I say, what do I, not Epicurus, I say Epicurus.
I mean, you know,
or that was my, like, that's how I phonetically pronounced it, I suppose.
It's the emphasis on the
right,
syllable.
Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about is that I wanted to do some Michel Serres with you. I've been wanting to get into his work because, like Badiou, although extremely stylistically different in their writing, but like Badiou, I think Michel Serres has a kind of way of writing that thinks the theorem and or the problem, if you want to follow what Deleuze and Guattari say about him in 1,000 Plateaus, but thinks the theorem and the poem together. Serres He studied at the Naval Academy and then went to the École Normale, where he did his dissertation, at least his primary one, on Leibniz. It's like an 800-page book
Ooh, nice. Interesting.
on Leibniz, which I think was proposed to be translated and was supposedly translated for Clinamen Press, ironically, given the topic of today's discussion. It exists in catalogs, but I did a bunch of searching and hunting and never found the translation. So that book is still untranslated. I've talked to Gil Morejon, our friend, about translating that. He was able to give me a PDF of the French, because I don't think the English translation actually exists. And I've looked at it some. And what's interesting too, and the reason why I bring this up, and also just to say, Michel Serre, the thinking the theorem and the poem together means like he's mathematically he's trained in the history of the sciences, as evidenced in this book, and as the very title of the book, The Birth of Physics, kind of asserts. I'm just talking in general terms about Serre here, and I'll be quick. So his book on Leibniz is not just philosophically rigorous, but has that mathematical scientific background, because that's kind of who Leibniz was. You can't really just focus on the philosophy or the mathematics. You kind of leave out big swaths of his work. Serre's published, I think, 50, 60 books. If you look at his bibliography, it's pretty extensive. It's amazing. And he began, if you look at this book, even though it was published in 77, he began writing it in 1970. So that'd have been 2 years after the publication of his Leibniz dissertation, which was in 68, also kind of like Deleuze, right? He was contemporary of Gilles Deleuze, although outlived him quite a while. Serre was pretty old when he died. I think he was 89. So he was an old guy, but passed a few years ago. But yeah, he's got over 50 books, one of which was translated by Dan Smith, we've had on, right? I think he mentioned in passing translating the little Thumbelina book. Some of his other works, a selection of, he's got 5 volumes on Hermes, who for him is kind of this figure of the sciences. He translates messages from like the gods to humans and back again, right? He's the messenger, a figure, which also takes on the form in later Serre's work of the angel, who's able to like mediate. And one of Serre's ideas about science is this translation and mapping of domains and one another, which is maybe only significant for this book in the sense in which The Birth of Physics deals with hydraulics, with flows, and in a certain sense, whatever is translated is a flowing across from a source to a target and back again. Because I think for Serre, it's a kind of a dynamic, ongoing process. It's not just a one-time thing. In any case, I guess a few things to say is one of the oppositions that he draws, which I find fascinating, is the fact that for him, Lucretius's ontology, if you will, just broadly speaking, is opposed to Leibniz's. And even though he doesn't, that's not the focus of the book, the fact that he comes back to it several times in the book is very interesting, especially for someone who would have dedicated years of his life and staked his academic career on Leibniz, to be so open and so, I guess, generous to the text of Lucretius, who in the Epicurean and the atomist vision is thinking of bodies, or even just on the minimal level, void and atoms, right? Whereas for, at least for Serre's reading, and I think that it bears fruit, I guess it's not a controversial thing. For Leibniz's world, it's a full vision. And one could even say for something like Aristotle, if you look at his ontology, he's very similar, where he says something like nature abhors a vacuum. The question of the void in ancient philosophy is a fascinating one in and of itself, and something that Badiou himself, just to bring him up once more before we stop talking about him, in Being an Event, he kind of has some meditations, which is what he calls his chapters in the book. He has some meditations on some of these ancient philosophers and the role of the void in their theory. And obviously for Badiou, the void becomes not just an ontological notion, but is mathematical, right? It's the empty set. And at some point we'll have to go into Badiou. He's actually a fascinating writer, and he's a very clear writer. I think this is the opposition that's so fascinating, right? I mean, because Badiou, who asserts kind of a thinking the theorem and the poem together, on one side is one of the clearest writers. Whether I agree with him or not on certain issues, fine. But his style, at least his way of philosophizing in that sense is, like the direct opposite of someone like Hegel, who uses the speculative unfolding of language to really mind fuck you, and is, at least in terms of clarity, you have to read him several times over. Whereas I think with Badu, he has a very much more direct style. I'll just say direct. I think with Sayre, what's interesting, right, is that on the other side, instead of, there's a sense in which, even though he may sacrifice the mathematical precision of Badu by thinking the theorem with the poem together, he gets the bonus of being able to weave these extremely transporting and kind of poetic lines. And so when you read him, yes, he is rigorously talking about science, but he is not sacrificing any of the poetic fluidity of the French language, which is why it's even a feat that a lot of his work is in translation. Although a lot of it isn't, but I may have told you this, but like Badu reminds me of Simondon to a certain way, because Simondon means what he says. And even if there may be an intensity to the work, the philosophy takes precedence, where the prose is pretty lucid, I will say. And with translating someone like Sayre, I might as well try to translate someone like Flaubert, where there is something going on in Sayre's text that bears witness, that takes, I mean, even if, how do you like even talk about this text as fitting a genre? Is it philosophy of science? Yes. But is it also a kind of philosophy of poetry? Also yes, right? I mean, he's doing this interesting reading of Lucretius, which is, and a lot of Lucretius was the only one to philosophize in poetry. We know Parmenides, for example. You could even think of like Heraclitus's, the fragments that we have of him, almost being an antecedent to a precursor to like Nietzsche's aphorisms to a certain way, right? The theorem in the poem is not absent in the work of ancient philosophy. Probably even the opposite is true. Aristotle is an outlier in this domain, where his more, let's just say, putting the science first prose, where the mystery is unveiled, if you will, and the language being translucent to reveal an object, that kind of ideological decision in the writing of Aristotle, I think is very much an outlier, if you will, in ancient philosophy. So there's something about, Sayre going back, and this is one of his moves that he likes to do, where he tries to think of discontinuities in the history of science, because he's going to look at Lucretius's text and argue for, and not just Lucretius, because he's bringing in Archimedes, right, who I think is one of the other champions in the book, along with Democritus and some of these other figures, Epicurus, that we've talked about. But in terms of, de rerum natura, on the nature of things or whatnot, Lucretius's text, he's going to go back and kind of show how there are these discontinuities in the history of science when we look back at the ancient sources. If we think of them, he says something early on in the text that you may remember, and I'll pause here and let you respond. He says something really early on in the text, even though it's a passing, where he's like, there's something about discrediting the state of the sciences or the knowledges of ancient thinkers, and thinking of them as like, and there's fair say that, we can think of them as being ignorant and being geocentric, even though there were figures like Aristarchus, who was able to measure the relative diameter of the sun and the moon and blah blah blah, and had a heliocentric idea, 15 centuries, or how many centuries, maybe 18 centuries before Copernicus. Anyway, Sayre's point is that there's a way in which we, like, as moderns, to like diminish the state of the sciences or understanding in ancient times, in order to like narcissistically pat ourselves on the back for the progress that's been made since, whether it be the Enlightenment or the Renaissance or whatnot, which ironically was, it was in the Renaissance where we started getting so many of the lost texts back, including the Greek sources, Plato, Aristotle, including Lucretius's text, right? So it's interesting that I know the Dark Ages is a silly term, but it's interesting that that eclipse being lifted is about rediscovering a lot of these ancient sources. But in any case, Sayers does this move a lot where he is kind of trying to show how there's like he'll even look at like ancient Babylonian numismatics and mathematics and show that the sexagesimal, like the base 60, is something that we see in various forms of computing and various other forms of various algorithms, right? And so there's a way in which Sayre wants to try to show how thinking of science as a mere kind of linear progression in progress. Well, that was redundant, but a kind of linear like building blocks. How that's not always true, right? He kind of I had the privilege to translate a text of his from one of his books on geometry. It's called Chaos in the History of the Sciences. And this is like the main kind of argument in that chapter that I translated, which is just about how the linearity of the sciences is a kind of ideal that we, or even like a fetish. And even if it had, even if it's not completely wrong, to take that as a given is a kind of ideological assumption, and it does a disservice not only to the ancients but also to ourselves by like not being honest about how, let's say, the dialectic of science and learning works. But I know that was a lot. I'll let you respond to any of that as you see fit.
So I guess in terms of the reading, I found him pretty lucid and clear. Was definitely one of the, not that it wasn't like the easiest reading ever, but it was fairly approachable. He reminded me quite a bit of Deleuze, honestly, just in some of the preoccupations with, obviously, with flows and the
Yeah,
sort of mathematical aspect to things. The
the
probably the
differential.
right, yes, yeah,
Mhm.
precisely. I guess in terms of the genre, I was kind of curious because, obviously I'm still, somewhat of a novice. Would you consider this to be, is this speculative metaphysics or speculative ontology, or is that kind of just, I suppose, ontology would be a subset of metaphysics, or
Yeah, I mean, depending on the author, they could define it in different ways. Like if we, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, this is where terminology gets interesting because
right? Yeah,
someone like Levinas is going to have a definition of ontology is kind of like war and metaphysics being closer to ethics, or vice versa. Leaving him aside, who's a fascinating author that I'd love to talk to you about sometime. You do bring back to the remark I made earlier about it's hard to categorize this
right.
in
Yeah,
a genre. For example, it reminds me of a question asked to Deleuze and Guattari when they published A Thousand Plateaus. You know, Deleuze was asked, like, where do you categorize A Thousand Plateaus in the quote unquote genre of literature, or even genre of whatever you want to call it? To a certain extent, they, and I mentioned this before the episode, they talk about reading A Thousand Plateaus like one listens to a record. So they already have a kind of a musical model to it. They obviously delve into, I mean, they delve into a kind of geological stratification of that has ontological bearings. They go into politics, they go into art, they go into anthropology, yada, yada, yada. And the list says it's a book of philosophy. And I think to a certain extent, more so than something like Anti-Oedipus, which I do think obviously has a philosophical bearing, but is more of the polemical side of capitalism and schizophrenia.
yeah,
But it's similar with Sayre's Birth of Physics, right? Because I do think obviously it has ontological implications, and he is asserting a kind of on he is finding an ontology within Lucretius's text that is at one and the same time has scientific bearing. Even if it has to be modulated, I'm sure Sayre could have gone into this with quantum fields and quantum mechanics, even if one would have to. And I think this is part of what Thomas Nail tries to do in volume one, which we'll have to bug him about when we get him on. There's still something to be found in the clinamen, which is one of the obviously the themes that makes atomism, that makes Epicureanism work. That I think what Sarah is trying to do, and this is why it's not just ontology, but also a kind of philosophy of science, a kind of history of the sciences at the same time, by showing the clinamen is a veritable principle of physics, right? And showing it's, whether it be like in relation to what I was talking to you earlier about the second law of thermodynamics, where heat kind of flows downhill
Mhm.
towards cold, and not all heat can be transformed into work, right? So there is an increasing entropy, etc. He tries to see the clinamen in more modern terms. That's just one example. That's not the only one. So yeah, you've got that aspect to it. Another subtext of the book is this promotion of a kind of Venusian politics as opposed to Mars. And I think this is where Deleuze and Guattari sees upon him in A Thousand Plateaus to say that the war machine is attested to by epistemology. Look at Michel Serres' book on the birth of physics,
Hmm.
where the hydraulic model is opposed to a kind of a royal science of solids. They kind of build off of this privileging of a hydraulic model, of a model of flows, of a liquid history, inventing liquid history, as Sarah ends the book with. There are political implications to it, which I think remain less articulated, but kind of swell up and down in the book at times. It's also a reading of a great work of literature, of Lucretius's text, right? So it has literary criticism aspects to it. It is a literary, and this is why I think Sayre's literary style itself too. I mean, you said he's lucid, and I think that's obviously true. It's just that he doesn't write in the way that one might think a book about the history of science or ontology might take, right?
Right. Yeah.
He writes in a way that flows, just to use this term. And I'm not even trying to
Yeah.
punt on the topic. I'm thinking also kind of about Nietzsche's call for his wish to have written in Italian rather than German, because of the need for this fluidity of movement, this a speed, if you will, to maybe to accommodate oneself to the vortex, the vortices of thought, the swirling, dancing nature of chaos that kind of Nietzsche romanticizes at times, but also I think takes as an image of thought. What other genres could one find in there? Is it also metaphysics? I think so. I mean, I think to a certain extent, especially if one wants to roughly extrapolate from the source of the physics of Lucretius's text implications about the soul, which Lucretius does think in terms of material atomistic composition. And Sarah would just warn, I think, that one of the things one too quickly takes the clinamen and psychologizes it. I think that's what Sarah wants to forego immediately, psychologizing the clinamen as being just a kind of psychological principle of freedom, that there is from equilibrium the slightest minimal deviation that would be a mere kind of psychological principle of freedom. I think Sarah is wary about that, but includes that within his critique. And I do think that that too is where there is a critical aspect to Sayre's work as well. You could say not necessarily in the Kantian sense, but in the sense of critiquing our own arrogance about the progress of modern science, our own ignorance about the state of ancient science and philosophy. So one could call that epistemology. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari kind of assert, that they find in The Birth of Physics. And that's not the only thing they find, but I think that that's what at least inspires, I assume, Deleuze, but who knows, right? They're a crowd that inspires them. They're finding an epistemological, critical intention in The Birth of Physics. It's not just metaphysics or ontology, then, right? It's also epistemology. It's a critique of our knowledge and the way in which, and for Deleuze and Guattari, that's immediately political, right? It's the way in which state science, royal science, whatever, privileges solids, privileges a kind of metric division, or it's striating space and blah blah blah. All these terms which are found in A Thousand Plateaus, which I'll try to be light on here, but you get what I'm saying. So in terms of the genre of the book, I do think it's multifaceted. As I said, like the stylistically, it is prose, but there is a way in which the ideas aren't necessarily first and foremost. It's not obviously dry denotative or even signifying. There's something that slips, that slides in the text, and so you do see. I mean, some of the things that I tweeted out, you saw, right, where it's like I'm a vortex. Sarah says shit like that, where that starts to border on a kind of poetic rhapsody. And so there it too attains not just the status of literary criticism, but the form of, one could say, literature itself. I'm sure there's more we could like go into in terms of what genres that it does, or I mean, which ones would we exclude? Because I do think there's an ethics there. I already said there's a politics that already implies a kind of ethics. And as we know, I mean, I've talked to you about this when we discuss Lucretius every now and then about, Lucretius being wary about, or thinking philosophy was meant to promote a kind of ethical empowerment where we are not, for example, afraid of death, where fear is the thing that's like motivating the baseness and evilness of humans to act contrary to whether it be nature or ethical principles or wisdom. And so we fear death because we believe, when we die we split off and are able to like look upon ourselves and weep, and we have these fears of this afterlife, this punishment by the gods, etc. I mean, Sayre does delve into some of that later in the book. I know we didn't read that for today, but you can already see that I think Sarah finds in Lucretius a kind of whole scope, a whole spectrum of fields of inquiry that makes his text and Sayre's text kind of uncategorizable, or at least polyvalent.
I do like how he refers to solids as just very slow moving liquids,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very good arresting criticism of the sort of assumptions that we bring into physical sciences and the way that we interact with things. But it really gets me going in terms of our old friend time and motion, because of at different scales can be perceived, or time moves at different scales relative to size, right? Which I think gets into a little bit of Sayre's discussion overall in the book, because at this kind of like fractal ontological level, I brought this up on the show before, the way that a fly, for example, perceives the motion of our hand, due to their size, they can
Hmm.
perceive our motion more quickly and then move out of the way. Obviously, you can kill a fly, so it's not like you can't overcome that. But that just illustrates, I think, in terms of the perceptual apparatus, that would be like time dilation, effectively,
Hmm.
is the scientific concept for it. If you think about the movie, what was it? The Martian or something like that? The Martian, or was it
No, that's Interstellar,
right,
I think. No,
Interstellar?
or is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
what you're
It
talking
wasn't,
about?
no,
Or
you're
you're
right. It was Interstellar
okay?
because Matt Damon was on that one planet and they had to consider how long, et cetera, et cetera. Like that all came into play. That's interesting too, because like the way that if we look at our lives, at our or even perhaps our physical bodies, right? If we observe them over, depending on how long the duration of our observation is and what our perspective is, we could be a blink of an eye. We would perhaps resemble a flow of like a linear flow of human back into human back into human. It's like this snake that emerges from the first human babies back into the mother, and so on and so on. Depending on your perspective relative to time and position and size, etc., the way that things appear comes into question, right? It's not this eternal stasis. Everything's in motion, right? Which kind of falls into a lot of what Sarah's trying to get at with this idea of solids being just a very slow moving liquid.
Yeah, and part of what you're discussing is this question of speeds. For example, the speed of light, which is theoretically a limit, if you will,
Theoretical limit,
theoretically
yes.
impossible. Yeah, but it's that traveling close to the speed of light where, depending on our frame of reference, time passes in a different manner. Now, this is something interesting because the question you're bringing up is actually a very Bergsonian question. This is where the heart of the debate, and if it's debate, disagreement, discussion of the nature of time between Bergson and Einstein, for example, comes into play. And this is one of the reasons why Bergson is led to write duration and simultaneity. and to say the great thinker Einstein is wrong, and that is its own fascinating deep dive that we'll have to do sometime, because for Bergson, he would want to say that this way of framing, you brought up the whole thing about like two brothers or twins, right? One stays on Earth and one goes at the traveling close to the speed of light or whatever in an aircraft and comes back. And we have this kind of common sense way of saying, due to relativity, something like, time didn't pass, as not as much time passed, whether it be biologically, chronologically speaking, for the one traveling at close to the speed of light. And Bergson, and this is framed in terms of experience, or even in terms of, as I said, biological aging, usually is what is discussed. And Bergson will want to say that that is not correct. And the problem is, obviously, is that if we speak in terms of biological aging, there's obviously a truth to it. But I think Bergson can't have there be this discrepancy. Again, that would be something wherein, to tie it back to Sayre, what's fascinating too, and I think Sayre himself would speak this way, and I think he does at times, but it's not the main focus of things, because he's thinking of atoms and the elements, for example, which you brought up, sort of the max. If the atoms are the minima, if the void is the zero, and then the atoms are the minima, kind of like the clinamen is the minimum discrepancy or incline from equilibrium, from what between the curve and the tangent, right? It's that minimum. Then the elements in the physiocratic sense, right? In the kind of Ionian pre-Socratics, right? The elements of air, fire, earth, water, they're like the maxima or something like this, which is kind of interesting to think of, even though they can themselves compose further bodies. In any case, what's interesting is, on that level, you can see a kind of, the theory of flows bears out, right? That even though I think for Sayre at its state, they would be like limit cases, right? Fire would be a limit case of earth or air and vice versa, which becomes fascinating to think about. This is also where the
I mean, it
differences.
totally is, especially if you think in terms of atomic versus chemical process, literally in the sun, right? It's like the atoms are so close together that they fuse and create, the hydrogen atoms fuse and create energy.
And by close together, you mean the pressure?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
They're
right.
squeezed together
Yeah,
to like the maximal limit. And once you reach a certain pressure threshold, then you create heat
yeah, the density,
or
the
light.
pressure, all of that,
I guess
right?
light
Yeah,
creates heat, yeah.
exactly.
Or heat creates light, rather.
It's just energy. That's what I was going to say too with Einstein. Why I brought him up at all
Energy
was
equals mass times the speed of light squared.
right. So with this equation, we do have a kind of modern formulation of this principle that Sayre is
Yeah,
deriving
it is
from
almost like void.
Lucretius's
Yeah,
text.
I want to almost say that is the speed of light the clinamen, but I don't know if that's my random brain like actually
I
picking up
guess
on something, or am I like totally off? Like, there's no in
I
between.
I don't know if we would say it's the clinamen itself. What you're seizing upon is the fact that when Sayre talks about something like the Thalweg, which I brought up to you, right? Which literally means the way of the valley, which is like the kind of slope that
Declination, yeah,
the maximal declination that leads to the lowest basin or whatever, right? So you've got these forces working in tandem to cause this like maximal flow. I think that's where this notion of the speed of light as a kind of maximal stream, if we think of the flow of photons or
yeah.
the flow of the waveforms of light as a kind of maximal stream, and obviously the way of calculating too is the speed of light in a vacuum, which is interesting, right? Because Sayre will talk about these obstacles to be overcome, right? Because flows are obviously going to be maximal in the Thalweg, in that maximal declination, that maximal flow, when there are no obstacles, right? So light passing through a medium.
Doesn't he even say though something about like if there were no obstacles that light would travel faster than, there's something like that, or maybe I just read it incorrectly.
The calculation, what is it, 299,000 something kilometers per second, whatever the
100
fuck.
and I think I always use mile, like 186,000 miles
Okay.
per second.
So you see what I'm saying? There's something like that, right? We have to look that up, but that constant is meant to be speed of light in vacuum, unimpeded. And in any case, I guess I will say that your point about the theory of solids, of statics, that solids being, and this is Sarah's point, right, being the very kind of slowed down flow makes sense, not just in terms of chemistry, but also in terms of our understanding of
I mean, the
relative,
Earth has a
our understanding
molten
of mass and energy.
the Earth has a molten core, for example, right? That's an even more stark, will get your mind really going in the way that I think Sarah wants to.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is why not only
What's more
steam,
solid than the Earth? You know what I mean? Like from a certain standpoint of common sense, let's say.
the terra firma, that, but that's the surface, right, on which
Yeah,
we
exactly.
stand on.
That is
Closer
just moving
to the heart of
slower.
the earth
Yeah.
is, as you're saying, it's molten. This gets important for Deleuze and Guattari with metallurgy, the kind of the science of metal, which again, something fun to talk about at some point. So yeah, you're right. And the way that Sayre talks about the earth is interesting because he'll talk about it as kind of filled with these hollows and these cavities and these which becomes important for the atomism of Lucretius versus Leibniz that I brought up earlier, right? For Leibniz, the plenum is the principle, whereas for Lucretius, you need the void for interactions, for flows to communicate, if you will, right? How are you going to have a path if there isn't the void, emptiness, right?
Oh,
For
gotcha.
the
Okay.
flows
Okay.
to sort of traverse.
That is important. I did want to highlight that part of, I guess, why I was thinking about the speed of light in this regard is because of the three, can't remember what he refers to, the clinamen, the void, and the atom. Those are like the three
Those are the basic
absolutes, perhaps, or not
principles.
absolutes, but
They're yeah,
they're the three like things that
they're
cannot
the,
be divided further,
at least the atom, that is true. In terms of dividing the void, it becomes a strange principle.
dividing by zero, sort of null.
Yeah. But in terms of the clinamen is actually what allows us to think about this indivisibility, right? Because it is the
But like
minimal
they're
angle.
all like imminent to one another, because one thing he wants to make clear is there's no prime mover, there's no first mover that has to set in motion
Right.
the fall of the atoms. That it is already, that's already predicated within the whole system or of relations between these three
Right.
basic functions of the universe.
And we saw that in Marx too, thinking the atom, the fall of the atoms, we're already thinking streams, right? We're already thinking the line, if you will. We're already thinking these trajectories. And I think that's why Sayre too is thinking already with the Klineman being, let's say, a fundamental principle or whatnot, of even if it happens here or there, it happens by chance, it calls into question the universality of laws themselves, which I thought was an interesting way of formulating it because it reminded us of our discussion of Meillassoux and hyper chaos, although that's its own category that we can revisit at some point. I know you said you wanted to, but calling into question the universality of laws with the Klineman app kind of operating by chance, we already have to think not just the declination, or we're not just thinking the fall of atoms and therefore the line, the stream, but we're also thinking vortexes, right? We're thinking vortices because of the Klineman, right? We're thinking, and this is where I think you saw the relationship with Deleuze, because for Sayre, we already have a kind of, we can call it a primitive calculus. This is what it literally is called, if you will, the method of exhaustion formulated by Archimedes for blah, 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 all this shit that we already have with the Klineman, an understanding of that minimal, the infinitesimal is what I think we would call it today, following Newton and Leibniz, but we already have that minimal deviation from a given point. We can call it equilibrium, right?
Yeah, equilibrium would be the way to, I think, right? Because he
And I
wants
do,
to discourage the notion of the point, because where is a point in a thing without borders like the universe?
mhm.
A thing without an edge, where does distance even makes sense, or not distance, but direction. Like, how do you determine directionality of a flow when there is no edge?
Yeah, in absolute space, there is no directionality, right? So there is no up or down, left or right. And I do think it's interesting too that with even the notion of universe, with his reading of Lucretius's text, we have this not just a hypothesis, but almost axiomatically deduced idea about the plurality, the diversity of worlds, and therefore a kind of non-totalizing universe, however paradoxical that might seem, and therefore a sort of plurality of universes, which we say multiverse these days. But again, it's this idea that Sayre finds, even though he doesn't talk about multiverses, right? But he kind of discusses, this is a kind of famous section early on, and maybe in book 2 or book 1 of Lucretius's poem, where we are talking about the diversity of worlds, their birth and death, and so we are kind of, in a certain sense, no longer confined to a universe.
Right, that
So
is true.
already in a text,
Interesting.
in an ancient text like
Yeah,
this, we already have a kind of conception of the multiverse, even though it's a different, perhaps,
yeah,
obviously that idea has its own kind of status today, that whatever. I think, again, going back to Sarah, he would want to say it's, we have to be careful about. I think it would be different than Leibniz's possible worlds. With Leibniz, the possible worlds are selected among by some god creator who's choosing the best of all possible
yeah,
worlds.
exactly. He's
With
giving the atoms or whatever the little nudge to
right,
start
and
off the motion of the world, or the universe rather.
so with Lucretius, there are no gods, so to speak. Right? He follows Epicurus in this way, where it's like there are no gods. You don't have to worry. And if there are gods, they don't care about us. If they do, they don't want to punish us. So don't worry. They have better shit to do. I think that that's part of the interesting sort of ethical implications of this reinvestigation of an ontology that I think, again, Sayre kind of starts the book by saying how much atomism or the principles of Lucretius, if not today or still today, but for a long time, were kind of thought as pseudoscientific at best. And I think that this is one of the interesting that Sayers is doing by relying on a whole multiplicity of disciplines, but specifically science itself, physics itself, to dispute that and to find not just a validity, but find something, go against the grain, go against the flow of time
Hmm.
of science, the linearity of science, and show that we can learn a lot by returning to this ancient source. That's why the text ends with this invention of liquid history, because it's in this hydraulic notion of history. Sayre himself says, like, history is a physics. It's in this kind of nonlinear notion, paradoxically, of science and of history, that we see progress, if you will, back in the past, in something that we had forgotten or repressed, or at least for Deleuze and Guattari, this isn't necessarily the word that Sayre uses in terms of repression, which has its own hydraulic metaphor, if you will, in something like Freudian theory of the unconscious. The id being like a ball, or sorry, the ego being like a ball of submerged in the id, or floating in the id, is the whole hydraulic model in Freud could be a fucking dissertation.
I was starting to see kind of, at least at the very least, like an etymological correspondence with Freud's use of anaclysis and the clinamen, that clina or
Yeah,
clin or whatever root aspect of it made
I'm
me.
not.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
Mhm.
And I brought up to you specifically Death Drive because of the orbital, the falling aspect, and that sort of almost like a declination, because an orbiting is falling. It's a controlled fall. I've said this before, but whenever you orbit the Earth, for example, you have to meet the exact speed. A certain speed will keep you traveling around without falling or without shooting off into outer space.
I'm not sure if in Freud it's a noun, if it's just anaclysis, like cathexis. I do think it's more, because the phrase that he uses is what's on Laning's typus, right? Which is the what we translate in English as the anaclitic type. We have the narcissistic object choice, right? But we have the anaclitic choice as well. The narcissistic choice would be sort of choosing based on our own image, right? But for Freud, the anaclitic type would be the sort of the opposite, where we're kind of choosing based on this manner in which obviously the image is, again, always the baby suckling at the teat, right? So the mother is a kind of prototypical anaclitic type, because for Freud, when he talks about an anaclitic type, he's not even really talking about persons. He's talking about libidinal history, if you will. He's talking about, and again, libido has its own hydraulic notion, but the way in which the drives, the sexual drive, props, leans on, and as you said, is inclined on, and we still have the word
Yeah, yeah,
incline,
yeah. Right.
decline, all of that relates back to clinamen. It leans on the self-preservative drive, right? So there is a sexual component to the hunger, the drive for feeding oneself, being fed, if you will, at the mother's breast, prototypically again. So you're right. There is a whole, and again, as I told you, Freud's not a Epicurean. He's not necessarily thinking in line with Lucretius, but I do think that the hydraulic model that Sayre takes from Lucretius, from Archimedes, etc., we can find a kind of hydraulics in Freud, which to a certain extent is thinking more to get to the death drive, is thinking, in terms of modern thermodynamics, and is thinking in terms, obviously, he's got a whole, he calls it the economic model, but he's thinking in a kind of basic energetics, if you will. And I think this is why I brought up when Sayre kind of sees confirmed the second law of thermodynamics in the hydraulics of Lucretius's poem, the clinamen, et cetera, as the minimum declination from equilibrium. I think that that's where you see this notion of entropy. And this is why one of the refrains that he says, and he doesn't just write about it here in this book, but in Hermes 4 distribution, he has a whole essay on the eternal return, which I've translated a billion years ago. But one of the targets of reading Lucretius's physics is this argument against the eternal return, at least in the sense of physics, because Deleuze will take the eternal return and almost make it into a fucking ethics or a categorical imperative. But, and Nietzsche too, you can find that in his work. But for Sayre, if we think about the eternal return in the guise of physics or ontology, he sees Lucretius's text as being against that, because I think for him, I think the plurality of worlds and universes already precludes it, that there would be some kind of rebirth, or that things would work out in this eternal repetition, right? I think for Sayre, he takes seriously this notion of the contingency of the clinamen. And so things don't play out, right? And so for him too, death is not symmetrical with life in the way we can think about in a kind of new agey kind of way. It's asymmetrical. They're not even opposites, really. This is where things get are paradoxical in Sayre's text, but following the logic, I think it makes sense.
Interesting, because I was thinking about it as far as the return of and the return of difference. That kind of made sense as opposed to Sarah. Maybe I didn't read the section that you're referring to where he goes in about the eternal. I do recall reading about the eternal return.
He only discusses it in passing. He never really makes it a true theme.
Sustain, yeah, it's not a sustained.
This is why I think he did, as I said, Hermes 4 published the same year this is published. This is
Mhm.
why I think he devotes a whole essay to the eternal return. He goes and looks at Kant's dissertation on his whole thing on astronomy. I forget it's about the theory of the heavens and stuff. Kant's looking at, he's looking at Kant and saying Kant does something similar as we see in Democritus, Epicurus. We introduce, you start with equilibrium. You have a minimal shift. That's how you have existence at all. I think for Sayre. Even someone like Zizek says stuff like this, right? That, but he likes to be dramatic, and he'll turn existence into this something didn't compute, something fell out. And so existence is this whole botch, right? It's this whole like failure of things to like even out, if
Yeah.
you will.
Because if there's an equilibrium, then everything would be static. Everything would be at a 0 point without motion.
I think Sayre would say everything wouldn't be, which is another way of saying there would be nothing. So nothing would fall out. Or one could say, without the clinamen, without that minimum deviance, without the fault, if you will, you would never have atoms meeting. At least if we stick to like Euclid's fifth postulate about parallel lines never meeting in infinity, if atoms merely fell infinitely without a curved universe, right, without a curvature of space, they would merely fall without ever producing these chaotic vortices that Sayre is trying to describe, that appear in things like that appear in the hydraulic model, which is why he'll distinguish between homeoresis versus homeostat, which is just which is the static way of looking at it's hydrostatics, right? Where you're looking at, say, you're looking at the flow of water in a relatively stable sense, maybe just like a fucking bathtub, versus the ocean, which is that's dynamic. It has a dynamic model, which is where you get maelstroms and you get the unpredictability of the turbo of the turbine. You get the vortexes. So I think that too is why I think Deleuze and Guattari are talking about the hydraulic model as this political innovation where we are trying to look at smooth spaces like the sea, which then obviously becomes paradoxically striated for understanding something like the fleet in being, right? They look at Virilio and talk about the fleet in being, where you're trying to delineate a space to occupy. And I think that's why the paradoxical status of something like the engineer, like Archimedes, who is thinking the hydraulic model par excellence, he is also this innovator of maritime warfare. I think that too is why for Deleuze and Guattari, something like the blacksmith, the metallurgist, is kept at a remove from the centrality of society, because he's this paradoxical figure. He's the master of the flows of the molten weapon, who can create tools for agriculture, but also weapons for war. So there's something interesting about the engineer too in Deleuze and Guattari's thought, like Archimedes, who is put to death by the Romans, dies at the hand of the sword, but he is this master of warfare as well. That's not necessarily something like Sayre takes up thematically in the work, but he does point to it a little bit, right? Where keeps talking about Archimedes as the Syracusan, but he's thinking through mastering the flows, if you will, puts one kind of at a remove from it's to a certain extent, it's the exteriority of the war machine to the state, as I'll say, right? And the state's wanting to capture it, having to capture it and appropriate it. And I think that's to what they see in this opposition between royal science and minor science. And I think that they see in Sayre this invention of liquid history, this promotion of a hydraulic model, is they take it to be the investigation of the war machine. I'm not sure how Sayre felt about that. I would love to see his like response to A Thousand Plateaus. I wonder if there's some letter he wrote to Deleuze and like, hey, that was cool. Okay. He writes about in the book, he writes about Lucretius discussing this very fact of like, look, we live this limited amount of time. We're not guaranteed rebirth. I don't think we have rebirth. Why isn't it the lowest point to compete and to wage war and wage battle when we have this finite blip in which to like compose ourselves with wisdom? And I think it's similar to Nietzsche talking about the will to power is perverted or basest when it is turned into the will to have power and to wield power, right? I think that's part of, I think, what Foucault is saying in the preface to Anti-Oedipus when he's like, one of the axioms of Anti-Oedipus, or one of the ethical principles, is don't become enamored with power. All of these thinkers are in line with kind of pointing out the kind of seeds of fascism embedded in the lust for power.
I watched that movie Pi the other night, Saturday evening, because for one, I love the little scene about Archimedes, the king of Syracuse, and is trying to get him to solve this question of, is this gift he received made of solid gold? And he like agonizes for weeks over it and can't sleep and like takes a bath, and then that's how he mythologically at least
That's the legend.
develops the the concept of what is it, displacement and volume,
Displacement.
etc.
Yeah, he basically invents hydrostatics in this legend, right? The eureka is a Greek word that we know because it's what he supposedly shouts in his bathtub. Imagine him playing with a golden rubber ducky or something like this, right?
Also, interestingly, though, in that movie is you do have a lot. It's a big focus on mathematics and prediction, and the main characters trying to develop or trying to uncover a pattern within the stock market that could
Mhm.
be like mobilized to whatever predict the future prices, etc. And there's a few times where you'll see these vortices develop, like, I think he puts cream into his cup, etcetera, and then, like,
Mhm.
he's
Mhm.
talking to this numerologist, or I don't know, he
Right.
was one of these, like, Hasidic guys that's really into mathematics, and they start, like, mapping out these points, and it's a spiral. I just had this idea, this is I might even cut this out, but I was thinking maybe the reason you can't predict the price is because it's decided in the last instance.
I like you say that because Sarah has a line in there where he's like, there are no last
Right, there are only
instances.
instances.
Yeah, there are only instances. There are.
But it's like which way is the clinamen, which way is the atom gonna swerve? You
Mhm.
know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah. Or and when.
Which way relative to what? Yeah,
When and
exactly.
where, yeah, when and where is the Kleinman going to appear? Yeah. I think that that's the fascination with studying stable flows, static fluids versus dynamic. He brings up Bernoulli, right? Which is, I mean, there's so many different Bernoullis and they're all famous, but obviously, like, I think he brings up Daniel versus he calls him Jacques. We know him as Jacob Bernoulli, who I think was his uncle, right? Where it's only when you look at, he's like experimenting with these pipes and looking at flows of water through these pipes, but you expand the pipe enough and then you start to have instabilities, right? You start to have these kind of unpredictable vortices. You have turbulence develop outside of these narrower pipes that you're dealing with. And so whenever I think of like something like the super soaker, I always think of Bernoulli's principle and shit like that, right? Which has to do with
I was
like
gonna say
pressure.
I've experimented with pipes before.
Uh,
Yeah,
right. So
you
I
have my
mean,
permission to kill me.
nah, it's
Go
all
ahead.
good. You just think about flows under pressure and how pressure is treated in fluids to get things like pounds per square inch.
I mean,
Anyway,
there's even weird shit with like, the way that like a P trap, for example, works in a toilet is like it's the curving of the pipe. Basically, that mitigates the gases, reemerging from the toilet.
yeah,
Obviously, that's
okay.
gas. What is gas but liquid that's traveling very fast?
Some of the same principles are used to study the
Totally,
flow
yeah.
of air. And earlier we could say, when we were discussing Einstein and Bergson, we were discussing the flow of time,
Oh, yeah. Good,
which
good
is
point. Yeah,
something fascinating
yeah,
too.
totally.
Which I think that's why he calls for this invention of liquid history, because he is thinking about how we think of the flow of time. And I think that's what I was trying to get at a little bit with how we think of the flow of time in science, is constantly like a staircase or something, constantly like moving, progressing. And I think that for Sarah, there's this contingency where we forget or repress. I'm kind of thinking more in Deleuze and Guattari saying repress. We repress minor science, nomadic science, whatever you want to call it. We repress these scientific insights, or they get lost or forgotten. And so I think that's why there is this disorder in the sciences for Sayre. And so it's, I think that it's too easy to fall into a kind of false way of conceiving science as this kind of like linear progress towards the absolute or something. And I think that one might say that about history too. I mean, that's the question of the telos, whether it exists or not, in Hegel's understanding of history as this progression towards freedom, towards the good that might be called into question in the same way that one could call into question the progress of the sciences as being this linear step-by-step progress. There are contingencies and deviances that could be taken that could foreclose other possibilities. We don't have to go into sci-fi to think this, right? That certain pathways might foreclose others that would have allowed for a whole tech tree unlocking, whatever the fuck you want to call it.
There are people that think that there's like a slant in nature's evolution towards more deterritorialized forms, right? Talking about the way that the large bodies form and smaller bodies, etc. The Earth was just formed from a bunch of elements that fused together due to gravity and pressure and shit like that. The Earth emerges and then we emerge in terms of the scale. But then it goes in weird directions too because of, we start with single-celled life and then we go to multicellular. Now that would be an example of the way that nature prefers deterritorialized forms. But in terms of the way that, I don't know, this size thing is kind of strange, and the way that things develop from like this kind of top down, yet also bottom up. The way that the Earth was formed was by small pieces put together. They form this larger body, and then the larger body gives birth to smaller bodies. That's a weird. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? A galaxy is an accretion of stars that travel around a certain center of gravity. Galaxies make up the universe, or you could even, or, start with the solar system, right? Rocky bodies that are orbiting a star, a bunch of stars all orbit a center of gravity. They make up a galaxy. A bunch of galaxies, they make up a universe.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about different scales for different fields.
I suppose you could say an atom would be like a cell, an atom of whatever planet, right? A bunch of atoms of planet material accrue and accrete into a body. The
Well, that's what,
same
yeah.
sort of way that like a unicellular organism eventually accretes into a conglomeration of cells.
I think this is why Sayre talks about the creode, which is to describe the path a cell takes when it's the quote unquote best path it takes to form its own specialized organs. And if there is a disturbance to the system, the creode describes how there is a kind of self correction for that path to continue to be taken. That was one of the words I didn't recognize when Sayre brought it up for the first time in those opening chapters. He's talking about the creode, which was a term coined by some, I guess, biologist. I'm not sure. I'd have to look. But that's partly what I see you describing is this sort of optimal path, which wouldn't necessarily be the Thalweg, which is kind of a maximal path or a maximal declination. But there's an optimal path too. And I think that's where the ethics comes back in, especially towards the end of the book where he's talking about the wise man. I mean, if we want to think about philosophers, maybe not being wise men, or friend of wisdom, right? Lover of wisdom. There is this search for optima, which also coincidentally, especially since we're talking about Lucretius, who is more or less, if not following Lucretius directly, is inheriting some of his principles, the optima for living happily, living with wisdom is finding the minima, right? A little bit of the Lewis talk about a little bit of urban water, but I think Epicurus says like a little bit of bread and water, one can contend with the happiness of the gods, right? It's like, so there is a way of circumscribing the our desires, which is not the same as like seeding ground on them, but maybe finding that creode, that optimal, that best path for the libido, if you will, to form its attachments and cathexes and whatnot. And there's a way in which it can be done violently. I mean, one could just say like there's a analogy with destratifying too quickly. Right? You were just talking about deterritorialization, but there is a sense in which if your idea about nature deterritorializing progressively, I do think it's obviously contingent. I know you haven't ruled that out, but it would also be a question
Yeah.
of
I mean, I think it would be similar to the sort of clinamen has a very slight
yeah, there's the slight. I
preference
mean,
for.
yeah, we could find that in the way in which there could be finding optimums for declining the libido. I'm just thinking there's a
Yeah.
way in which one could plunge a little too quickly into
I
or
was
break
thinking
off
about
too quickly.
I
I
was thinking
mean,
about
that's
flows in terms of maxima and minima just because of there's certain water will always seek the lowest point, path of least resistance. I've made the claim metaphorically that capital has the same
mm,
property that it will always seek the path of least resistance. So if it doesn't have to alter the prior social whatever that much, it'll adopt whatever it has to up to a point, but it's going to seek out the path of least resistance to its aims. Maybe that's due to efficiency.
efficiency is one way to call it. If we're thinking about what I
I mean,
think we
even
take
just
from.
flows of water, not even to get as abstract as like the discussion of the flows of capital, but
I mean, efficiency, I guess, is it feels like a human imposed value
right. Yeah.
to discuss it, but if we take it in the broad sense,
In a way, taking the path of least resistance is an efficiency, right? That is what efficiency is to a certain degree.
yeah,
Although I guess that's kind of limited, right? What's the most efficient? The shortest path between two objects is a straight line. And I'm just thinking about the resistance, declination, and flows, energetics.
all of that goes into discussing the clinamen, and I think that it's worth meditating on. I don't have an immediate response, but I do think that that's good. I know there's like a billion other things we could talk about, but we I had tried to think of putting an hour limit on this, and we've gone for almost 2 now.
Have
So
we really? Has it been that
yeah,
long?
we may have started recording closer to 8, but
Yeah, that makes
that's
sense.
well, we did get to talk about a bunch of good shit. The question about the optimalization of dynamics. I think that's what we were just talking about, but we just weren't
Right,
quoting
right.
him.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that's true.
So
Good, good point.
I'm glad you brought up that point about capital like water. But it's ironic too, because in my back of my head, I'm thinking of our friend Griffin Melson, who we had on, right, where he might be like Marx's tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Maybe there is already this demand of going back to equilibrium.
A
Um,
death drive.
Death drive, the Klineman is takes more and more effort, becomes less and less
Well, I mean,
efficient.
it's entropy
It's
ultimately, right? Like
entropy,
we talked
right?
about, right? It's like
Which
you
I
can't
brought up in passing. Yeah, right. So
to produce something, you have to waste something. You have to sacrifice something. To
yeah,
go back to our discussion with Acid Horizon last week.
I mean, I think that this is why I brought up the second principle, because if
Right.
deriving from the principle is about, I think Sarah brings it up because it's kind of the flow of heat declining. What's gotten from it is that not all the heat in a system can be put to work, can produce work. So you don't have this perpetual mobile, right? There's always, whether it be through friction or whatever the fuck, there's always some kind of waste, to use the term that you just used. And I think that that's what I was trying to think when you brought up the etymological link between the anaclitic and Klineman, is how perhaps not all libidinal energy is able to, whether it be cathected properly or to be put to work in the psychical apparatus, that there's always some kind of leakage or some kind of waste. That's something that I think we can think
Yeah,
about
that's fascinating.
more broadly. And
I mean, the orbital stuff with the death drive too, also, I mean, that's kind of like adjacent to that discussion
mhm,
as well, which I think is really fascinating.
exactly, that's probably what.
There's a kind of stasis to the death drive, and it's like It has that sort of circular motion. It's a vortices of its own. It's
I mean, I
it's a
do think if
vortices, yeah.
if Freud is trying to think the death drive in this biological speculative way and be more speculative than he normally is, to think about this returning, there's like this elasticity to organisms, to ontogenesis, where there is
Right.
this devolution or involution to prior forms. I do think that one could see it also much more humbly as theorizing entropy in psychical libidinal systems, but we can
Yeah.
leave that as a hypothesis to be investigated, because I think that one thing analysts will be singular and never agree on is what the fuck the death drive means, right?
Yeah.
So
It's a multiplicity, man.
it's what was it? I think I've said this for body without organs before, although I only meant it half jokingly, where it's like the term mana in Levi Strauss, where it's an empty signifier or whatever. It sort of fits in. It's a shapeshifter, right? It's able to
Right.
take on whatever you need it to. It's like Humpty Dumpty. I mean, when I say whatever I want, whenever I say what I want, right? This like it's not how it works, right? But it's a good paradox. We can end there, brother.
Thank you all for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.